Zaguru Pema Sidi Hong Nga Hong Ben Zaguru Pema Sidi Hong Nga Hong Ben Zaguru Pema Sidi Hong. Hello everyone, and thank you for attending my Tuesday Dharma talk at the Chitta Bhavana Ashram. Today I am going to give a talk entitled The Status of Women in Ancient India and the Pali Tradition. This talk has not been heard since March of last year, so it's been just about a year since I've given it, so hopefully it will be of interest. It is a long talk, approximately 2 hours in length, and I'm wondering how people feel about that. Would you prefer to break the talk in two and have 1 hour today and 1 hour next Tuesday, or would you prefer to commit to the full 2 hours today? Or I could do both. I could give the full 2 hour talk today and the second half next Tuesday for those who are unable to stay. I prefer two as well, because that gives people the opportunity to hear the talk in its entirety, and it's all fresh in your mind as we proceed, whereas over the course of a week, the first half is likely to fade if we do it that way. So, everyone is okay with 2 hours? I don't hear any screams of nay. Okay, so that's what we'll do. Okay, just before we begin, give you some information about myself. I won't go into it in detail. I will mention that if you have any questions during the course of the talk, it is customary to save your questions to the end in a Dharma talk. But I think that's a little stuffy for me. And if you ask your questions in the course of the talk, the matter that you're asking about will be fresh in everyone's mind. So I do think that is better. However, in light of the fact that it is on paper, it's 1 hour and 47 minutes. In practice, I'm sure it will be 2 hours. So in view of the length of the talk, I would ask that you keep your questions short and to the point. So, that said, let's go right into it. The status of women in ancient India and the Pali tradition. In the middle of December 2012, a 23-year-old woman was attacked. She was gang raped and beaten with an iron bar in a public bus in Delhi, India. You may recall one of the places in the northwest that the Buddha actually taught is identified with Delhi, India. She and her boyfriend were then pushed out of the bus into the street. Her boyfriend escaped with his life, but the woman died of massive internal injuries. This incident, which made the headlines worldwide, underlines a serious problem, not just in India, but also in all of Asia and indeed the whole world. It was not an isolated incident. A month later, another woman was raped in similar circumstances. Studies show that 25% of Asian men have committed at least one act of rape. In some Asian countries, the percentage is as high as 50%. In India, 53% of children have been sexually abused. Parents who do not wish to have female children routinely abort female fetuses, and it is common for female children to be intentionally malnourished and uneducated compared to boys. At the same time, Bollywood films fetishize sex in the most sensational and vulgar ways and portray women as sex objects. The situation in Buddhist countries is better, but women are still often relegated to second-class status. The order of female monastics, the Bhikkhuni Sangha, has died out in most Buddhist countries. This is due to the discriminatory rules that were imposed in ancient times to keep the nuns in their place. In Theravada countries, in particular, nuns, where they exist at all, are forced to comply with 311 monastic rules compared to 227 for the monks. A nun with 100 years seniority must still defer to a monk of 1 day's seniority. In Thailand, it is actually illegal for a woman to wear robes as a nun. Were she to do so, she would be charged with the crime of impersonating a monastic. Religious Buddhists accept this because they are taught that this is how the Buddha set it up. In the West, an alarming number of Buddhist teachers in different traditions have been implicated in sex scandals of one sort or another. Vision TV has published an expose of this subject entitled In the Name of Enlightenment. In Nepal, suicides of monks disgraced for sexual infractions are a common occurrence. And I was told that by a friend of mine who's actually Nepalese. In this talk, I will discuss the status of women in pre-Buddhist India as well as the India of the Buddha's time in order to establish context. I will then critically evaluate the Buddha's own sexuality and the attitudes to women and sexuality attributed to him in the Pali Canon, especially in the suttas. I will discuss the context in which the rules for monks and nuns were codified in the Vinaya during the First Buddhist Council and later, including the philosophical or theological implications, and I always put that word theological in quotation marks when I use it, since Buddhism is a non-theistic tradition. However, there's no really alternative word. Dharmological is not very handy word. In any case, the philosophical or theological implications of this discussion. Finally, I will conclude with a survey of the status of women in the Buddhist world today and consider the significance of this discussion to the Dharma transmission to the West. Finally, we'll observe 2 minutes of silence in memory of the women and children who have been sexually abused worldwide, and we will dedicate the merit of this talk to them specifically. This talk will also be posted online on my blog with references. So let's begin with the traditional Indian view of women in the early and late Vedic period, specifically Indus Valley civilization between the years 3500 and 1300 BCE. Ancient Indian civilization originated in the 4th millennium BCE. It extended from northeast Afghanistan in the west to Pakistan and northeast West India in the east. It flourished till about 2000 before the Common Era. At its peak, it included about 5 million people and is considered one of the 3 great civilizations of antiquity and the largest in extent, about 1.6 million square kilometers. Indus Valley seals, that's stamps, not the seals, have been discovered as far west as Sumer. This was a Bronze Age civilization that developed new techniques of handicraft and metallurgy, including copper, bronze, lead, and tin. It was a highly organized mercantile society that included urban planning, baked brick houses, elaborate drainage systems, water supply systems, and large non-residential building complexes. The Indus Valley civilization is also referred to as Harappan civilization, named after the Harappa, the first site to be excavated in the 1920s. Over 2,600 archaeological sites have been identified. Although the Indus script has yet to be deciphered, many scholars consider it to be related to Dravidian, an Indo-Aryan language, the descendants of which are still spoken in southern India and elsewhere. Not much is known about Harappan culture. It appears to have been a class-based society consisting of religious, merchant, and worker classes. The recent discovery that men moved into their brides' homes suggests a matrilineal influence and that women were powerful and perhaps even equal to men. This is in striking contrast to other ancient civilizations, which were generally patriarchal and oppressed women. Clay figurines of goddesses have also been discovered. Quoting, "The women portrayed on the seals are shown with elaborate coiffures, sporting heavy jewelry, suggesting that the Indus Valley people were an urbane people with cultivated tastes and a refined aesthetic sensibility." That's from Lal, 2013. Gupta, 2002, says, quote, "One of the most known figurines is perhaps the dancing girl in bronze. Naked, but for a necklace and a series of bangles almost covering one arm, her hair dressed in a complicated coiffure, standing in a provocative posture, with one arm on her hip and one lanky leg half bent. This face has an air of lively pertness, quite unlike anything in the work of other ancient civilizations. Her thin, boyish figure and those of the mother goddesses found here indicate, incidentally, that the ideas of female beauty among the Harappan people were very different from those of later India. The Harappan people also made rough terracotta statuettes of women, usually naked, but with elaborate headdresses. These are certainly icons of the mother goddess and are so numerous that they seem to have been kept in nearly every home. They are crudely fashioned, so historians assume that the goddess was not favored by the upper classes who commanded the services of the best craftsmen, but that her effigies were mass-produced by humble potters to meet popular demand, unquote. The Indus Valley civilization is generally regarded as having been relatively pacific. So next, let's consider the Aryan invasion between 1500 and 1200 before the Common Era. The indigenous Indian society was disrupted after a period of internal decline, possibly related to environmental factors and resulting economic decline, due to a series of conflicts with patriarchal militaristic tribes originating near the Black Sea, the so-called Aryans. This invasion, quote-unquote, is referred to in the Rig Veda. And the modern view, actually, just to add a short comment to that, the modern view is moving away from the invasion theory and is seeing the Aryan incursion as more of a migration than an invasion per se. And then a migration or a series of migrations. The Dravidians were then pushed down into southern India. It seems that these conflicts resulted in the progressive assimilation of the local Harappan culture, reviving the Indus Valley civilization that led to the Vedic period that became the basis of historical Indian civilization to the present day. The Aryans introduced the consumption of soma, possibly ephedrine, a kind of amphetamine, possibly mixed with poppy and cannabis, to Indian religion. The inspiration of the Vedas themselves was attributed to soma. Sorry, just give me one moment. I'm looking for a footnote. Oh, there it is. Other candidates for ingredients of soma include honey, Amanita muscaria or fly agaric, ephedra, poppy seeds or pollen, cannabis, psilocybin, that's Psilocybe cubensis, a fermented alcoholic drink, Syrian rue, which is the Latin name for which is Peganum harmala, rhubarb, ginseng, opium, with wild chicory, and even ayahuasca. Sorry, just give me one moment. Okay, let's go on to discuss the Rig Vedic period then, from 1500 to 1000 before the Common Era. These dates are rounded, they're approximations, they're not exact boundaries. The view that ancient Harappan culture conferred a special status on women is consistent with the scholarly consensus that the women of ancient India enjoyed a unique status very different from the misogyny that we find in India today. As a recent comment demonstrates. Gerholt, 2004, suggests, quote, sexism and patriarchy are contrary to the fundamental teachings and beliefs of ancient Vedic and Buddhist philosophies, unquote. Although she recognizes that Indus Valley civilization was probably also patriarchal, she specifically associates the qualities of patrilinealism, patrilocalism, and patriarchy with the Aryan invasion that promoted the institution of Brahmanism. She concludes, quote, the Indo-European Aryans contributed to and heightened the hierarchical, patriarchal social structure of ancient India, unquote. Nevertheless, during the early Vedic period, women enjoyed many rights and privileges, including participation in society, that's a nice one, including tribal assemblies and religious ceremonies, education, choosing one's own husband, marrying more than one husband, voluntary remarriage of widows, divorce, and the pursuit of spiritual development, including the practice of asceticism. In addition, the practice of child marriage was unknown. Many of these rights and privileges are attested in the Vedic texts themselves, despite the fact that they were written by and for men. Even the rishis, the reputed divine seers, literally hearers, who authored the Vedas, included women. Quote, the Rig Veda mentions Romasha, Lopamudra, Apala, Kadru, Vishvavara, Gosha, Juhu, Vagambrini, Paulomi, Yami, Indrani, Savitri, and Devajami. The Sama Veda adds Noda, Akrishtabasha, Sikata Nivavari, and Gaupayana. In Mahabharata 12, on the other hand, there is a post-Vedic list of Marichi, Atri, Angiras, Pulaha, Kratu, Pulastya, and Vashista. That's quoted from the Wikipedia. In addition, Gerholt, 2004, also cites Salabha, which is from the Mahabharata, Maitreyi from the Rigveda, and Gargi from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. Okay, now let's discuss the later Vedic period, 1000 before the Common Era to 500 before the Common Era. So we are rapidly approaching the time of the Buddha. During the later Vedic period, the dominance of Brahmanism led to increasing patriarchy. Interestingly, the rise of Brahmanism corresponded to the replacement of the consumption of soma by symbolic ritual enactment, the so-called fire sacrifice, and finally the formula for soma itself was forgotten. Female divinities were relegated to second-class status, and women progressively lost the rights and privileges they had previously enjoyed. An increasingly rigid gender hierarchy was enforced. Women were secluded and became less able to participate in society. Their role was confined to the household, where their exclusive duty was seen to be obedience to their husbands. Education and participation in the tribal assemblies was forbidden to them. They were not encouraged or allowed to pursue the spiritual life. This included studying the Vedas. Vedic study became the exclusive prerogative of male Brahmin priests. Arranged marriages and child marriages were instituted. Women were not allowed to divorce their husbands or inherit their property. Widows were not allowed to remarry. Female chastity came to be viewed as a valuable commodity, conferring social status on the family. Women were regarded as chattel, and they could be given away or loaned like any other property. The practice of sati, in which the widow immolates herself on her husband's funeral pyre, was celebrated as the supreme act of filial devotion, and veiling, or purdah, was required. Women were equated with the Sudra, the lowest caste of slaves or servants in the Brahmanic four-caste system. These developments appear to correspond to a schism that occurred in Vedic society during this period. This schism was associated with two classes of Vedic deity, the Asuras and the Devas, also known as Suras. Originally, the Asuras, literally the word means lord, were a class of superior devas who inhabited the realm of the 33 gods, the Triastrimsa, on top of Mount Meru. The names of many asuras refer to natural abstractions, rather as in Native American spiritualism, Indus Valley civilization, etc. A new cult of deva worship emerged during the late Vedic period that declared the asuras demonic and began to persecute the older group of asura worshippers. The new deva worshippers were authoritarian. They supported the superiority of the Brahmins, the caste system, and they were misogynistic. The conflict between the Asura and Deva worshippers was mythologized. In the eastern part of the Indian subcontinent, the Deva worshippers achieved preeminence, whereas in the west, the Asura worshippers maintained their prestige, demonizing the Devas in return. The latter became the foundation of Zoroastrianism in Iran, with the supreme god Ahura, or Asura, the Mazda, the god of wisdom, at its head. Let's proceed then to the developments in the 6th and 5th centuries before the Common Era in India. By the time of the Buddha, And I just have a brief footnote on that. Although the conventional Western dates of the Buddha are still given as 563 to 483 before the Common Era, for example, in Google, I believe that's what you'll find if you just simply Google the question. An increasing number of scholars now believe that the Buddha was born in the first half of the 5th century before the Common Era. Hajime Nakamura puts his death as recently as 383 before the Common Era. Sorry, I'm just recovering my place. So by the time of the Buddha, the traditional Brahmanic culture had become completely ossified and decadent. The Vedic beliefs were no longer relevant to the new Iron Age society. Prosperity, money, and trading were increasing, greatly enhancing the social status of the merchant and worker classes, but social relativism was causing widespread social and spiritual questioning and discontent. This resulted in new philosophical movements and religious sects in the Middle Gangetic Plain. Interestingly, this is the same area where the Indus Valley civilization had flourished 2 millennia before. The more mystical teachings of the Upanishads were being popularized and becoming increasingly influential. Criticism of the Brahmin orthodoxy was growing. In northeast India, where the Buddha lived and Brahmanic influence was weakest, corrupt autocratic kingdoms and despotic autocracies vied for power with nascent quasi-republics and constitutional oligarchies. These were the 16 great realms, the Mahajanapadas, which flourished from 600 to 300 before the Common Era, ranging from Cambodia in the north and west to Asaka in the south and Anga in the east. Wars and political assassinations were frequent occurrences. The Buddha lived to see the genocide of his own clan, the Sakyans, by the Kosalan king Virudaka. The people were oppressed, subject to brigands who haunted the roads and the vast forests. They were often overtaxed by the state, which was desperate to maintain its hegemony in relation to the emerging mercantile class. On the other hand, workers were organizing themselves into trade guilds. Arts and crafts were flourishing. Work was becoming increasingly specialized, and knowledge was expanding. Others, essentially small farmers, became wealthy through land ownership. This turned the traditional caste system on its head. The position of women, especially widows, was untenable, and many women turned to prostitution in order to survive, since they were forbidden from inheriting the estates of their husbands. It is for this reason that the Buddhists tolerated prostitution, rejected by the Brahmins. This period corresponds to a worldwide phenomenon that German philosopher Karl Jaspers has called the Axial Age, the Achsenzeit in German, which he identifies with the period from 800 to 200 before the Common Era. Revolutionary new ways of thinking developed more or less simultaneously in Persia, India, China, Greece, and Judea during this period, including the birth of rational philosophy itself. Eric Vogelin has called this period the Great Leap of Being. Interestingly, the midpoint of the Axial Age, which is about 500 before the Common Era, is exactly the same distance from the advent of the Kali Yuga, which is 3102 before the Common Era, as our own time, 2100 of the Common Era. The 19th century began a period of science, exploration, invention, discovery, technology, and the beginning of industrialization and globalization. The year 2400, 300 years hence, corresponds to the full manifestation of Shambhala, which is prophesied to manifest in 2424 of the Common Era, according to the Kala Chakra. One might argue that this latter period, that is 1900 to 2400, represents the advent of a new axial age, and will be looked upon as such by humans of the future, assuming, of course, that we survive much longer. Futurist and inventor Ray Kurzweil has suggested that the crucial transformational moment of the new age will occur in 2045. This is the year of the singularity. This event will transform human society in qualitatively unpredictable ways because of the convergence of biology and technology. This is also fairly close to the end of the Mayan epoch in 2012 of the Common Era, which began in 3113 or 3114 before the Common Era, only 11 or 12 years later than the advent of the Kali Yuga, a remarkable coincidence considering the separation of the Indian and Mayan cultures. The Buddha himself was born very close to the midpoint of the Axial Age, about 500 before the Common Era. The great Tantric adept, Padmasambhava, who is credited with the conversion of Tibet to Vajrayana Buddhism, flourished during the late 8th century of the Common Era at the midpoint of the interval from the advent of the Buddhist epoch, around 400 before the Common Era, to our own time, around 2000 of the Common Era. Okay, that concludes the first part of the talk, the introductory portion, and also the traditional Indian view of women in the early and late Vedic period. Next, I'd like to discuss the view of women in the Shakti, Samana, and Shaivite countercultures, beginning with Shaktism. A famous motif found on a seal in the Mohenjo-Daro excavation of the Indus Valley civilization is a horned figure sitting cross-legged and surrounded by animals. This figure, called a Pashupati, a lord of the animals, has been identified with a precursor of the Indian god Shiva. Phallic symbols have also been found and identified as precursors of the Shiva lingam. The significance of the possible evidence for a Shiva cult in the Indus Valley civilization, which also practiced fertility rituals, is the association of Shiva, the male creative principle that dies and is reborn, the phallic tumescence and detumescence, with Shakti, the universal goddess principle without which Shiva is literally impotent. The word Shakti literally means power or energy. Shakti is therefore the dynamic, creative aspect of existence. In the human being, this energy is equated with intelligence, compassion, and divine love. Regardless of whether one accepts the identification of the horned figure of Mohenjo-Daro with Shiva, and by implication Shiva's consort Shakti, although in view of the apparently female positive character of the Indus Valley civilization, such an association is tempting, Shakti is mentioned a dozen times in the Rig Veda, and goddess figures, many of whom are cognate with Shakti, another 40 times. Although modern Shaktism did not fully flower until about 400 of the Common Era, its precursors clearly originate during the Vedic period and extend far back, even into the late Stone Age, about 20,000 before the Common Era. Next, we'll discuss Shamanism, or Shamanism. As we have already discussed, by the 5th and 6th centuries before the Common Era, the established Vedic Brahmin orthodoxy of India was no longer able to satisfy the religious and spiritual needs of many people. There were widespread skepticism, longing, and discontent. In response to this social, political, and spiritual ferment, new religious and philosophical movements appeared, defined and organized themselves. They gained the respect and adherence of many people. By the time of the Buddha, this Samana counterculture was already well established, especially in northeast India, where the Brahmanic orthodoxy was weakest. Materialist, hedonist, deterministic, and agnostic philosophies competed with Upanishadic Brahmanism and religious renunciation. It was this last group that the Buddha joined when he chose to renounce the worldly life at the age of 29, shaving his head and adopting the ochre or saffron robe, entirely without reference to joining any particular organization or monastic institution, which of course did not yet exist. The Pali word samana is very interesting. It is derived from the Sanskrit shram. Shram is a verb meaning to heat, cook, ripen, mature, seethe, boil, subdue, make weary, overcome, and conquer. The origin of the word is also conflated with sam, to gather together or integrate. Shram is the root of the English word shaman, a spiritual practitioner who cultivates a state of transcendent ecstasy in which he experiences visions of other worlds, communicates with spiritual beings, and acquires psychic powers. Sam is the root of samadhi, one-pointed concentration or meditation. The Pali English Dictionary says merely that a samana is a religious wanderer or recluse, but heat and light symbolism pervade the Pali Canon, as well as clear references to altered states of consciousness and psychic powers, or edis. The Samana counterculture rejected the authority of Brahmanism and the Vedas, although many of the spiritual and religious concepts of the Samanas were also prefigured in the Upanishads. And I should point out that there were also Brahmanic forest dwellers, or Samanas, as well. It is important to note that the Samana movement specifically rejected the authority of both the Brahmin caste and the Vedic textual traditions, despite these similarities. I am, of course, referring to the Nastika traditions, the non-orthodox traditions. Thus, the philosophy of the Buddha must be decisively distinguished from the so-called Astika schools, which accepted Vedic authority. The latter became the well-known Sankhya, Yoga, and Vedanta philosophical schools of Orthodox Hinduism, amongst others. This is an important point to remember in the context of the late Vedic attitude toward and treatment of women. The Samanas set out to discover the truth for themselves experientially. To this end, they adopted three fundamental practices: austerity, to purify kama, or karma; meditation, to cultivate mental concentration, or samadhi; and view, or philosophy, to cultivate wisdom or understanding, the same threefold division that we find in the Pali Canon. Jainism was already old when the Buddha appeared. It appears to have been founded in the 7th to 9th centuries before the Common Era by Parshva, or Parshva. Thus, it was probably at least 400 years old at the time of the Buddha. Jainism may have been a non-Aryan remnant of the Indus Valley civilization, though scholars dispute this. There are many similarities between Buddhism and Jainism. Nevertheless, the Buddha also criticized Mahavira, the leader of Jainism, about the same time as the Buddha, and distinguished himself from it as well. Immediately following his renunciation, the Buddha studied with two great philosophical teachers of the time, Alara Kalama and Uddaka Ramaputta. Alara Kalama was a proto-Sankhya meditation master in the Astika tradition, under whom the Buddha achieved the realization of the realm of nothingness, the Akincanayattanupaga. Uddaka Ramaputta was a Jain meditation master in the Nastika tradition. Therefore, he was a Jain meditation master in the Nastika tradition, therefore, under whom the Buddha achieved the realization of the realm of neither perception nor non-perception, and the Pali word is neva sanya nasanyayattanupaga. Enormous, two enormous words. Finally, the Buddha fell in with the group of five, led by Kondanya, the Brahmin ascetic who had predicted at his birth that Gautama would become a world teacher. The group of five had renounced the worldly life about the same time as the Buddha and practiced extreme austerities, including mortification of the body, breath control, mind control, and extreme fasting, practicing in cemeteries and elsewhere, similar to the Shaivites, which is why I discussed them. Or will be discussing them, I should say. After failing to find what he sought with Kalama and Ramaputta, Gautama joined them in these practices until he was on the verge of dying. Although many sources imply that Gautama practiced with the group of five for 6 years, this seems unlikely, since he must have studied with Kalama and Ramaputta for at least some period first. If one assumes that he spent a year with each of these, then perhaps the Buddha practiced with the group of five for 3 years, followed by a year alone, although there are alternative traditions hinted at in the Pali Canon, and I believe explicitly referred to in Nichiren Buddhism, that the Buddha actually left home earlier in the age of 29 and actually practiced for 11 years, which would actually fit the time frame better. but the mainstream view is that he left home at 29. The Buddha's practice of these austerities is vividly described in the Pali Canon. About the age of 35, according to the mainstream view, on the very verge of death, or perhaps a little before, Gautama accepted some rice pudding from a passing village girl, Sujata, at which point the group of 5 abandoned him as having reverted to the effeminate life of his youth. Gautama was on his own and had still not found what he was looking for. Next, I'd like to discuss Shaivism, as I mentioned. Shaivism developed out of the Vitara Upanishad. This Upanishad is the earliest textual source for Shaivism and may have been written down about 400 before the Common Era, the year of the Buddha's parinirvana. However, its origins are certainly significantly older. The practices of Shaivism included extreme asceticism, self-purification, a cemetery cult of human bones, the practice of yoga based on the cross-legged posture, disrespect for caste, association with untouchables, renunciation of the householder life and procreation, a northern Indian provenance, rejection of Brahman superiority, and reverence for the female principle. Shaivism is based on the worship, and thus, because of its reverence for the female principle, as I discussed earlier in connection with Shaktism, Shakti is, of course, the female consort of Shiva, so you can see the interconnectedness now, which is why I discussed Shaktism earlier. Shaivism is based on the worship of the original divine principle in Indian mythology, Pashupati, which is widely regarded as a prototype of Shiva. Similarly, during his Samana period, Gautama practiced extreme self-mortification, fasting, yoga, including breath control and mind control, and lived and slept in cemeteries. Similarly, in his later philosophy, the Buddha rejects the caste system, admits women to the Sangha in defiance of social norms, and references a return to the primordial tradition of which the Brahmanic cult and even the Vedas themselves are degenerations. Richard Gombrich, in his essay, Who was Angulimala, has suggested that Angulimala, of the Angulimala Sutta, was a practitioner of just this type, and I myself have also written a blog on the Angulimala Sutta, in which I came to the same conclusion as Gombrich, independently of him. In the course of researching the blog, I discovered that Gombrich, in fact, holds this view as well. This makes the Buddha's acceptance of Angulimala as his personal attendant especially interesting. So next I'd like to evaluate the Buddha's view toward and treatment of women, starting with the sex life of the Buddha. However, I have emptied my glass of water, so I'm just going to step away for a moment to refill my glass of water. If you give me 30 seconds, I will return. So, the sex life of the Buddha. Thank you. Unlike Yeshua, the Galilean Bodhisattva of the Jews, Jesus, Yeshua is actually closer approximation of his actual name than Jesus. Unlike Yeshua, the Galilean Bodhisattva of the Jews, who is portrayed in the canonical texts of Christianity as virtually sexless, the Buddha is portrayed in the words of the title of the book by John Powers, 2009, as a bull of a man. This is consistent with the Indian tradition of kama, or karma, in which a great man must have a great body. Thus, the Buddha was identified as a great man at his birth by the appearance of certain physical signs, including long, slender fingers, soft, smooth, golden-colored skin, a handsome, well-proportioned body, including beautiful thighs, strong torso, and erect posture, closely spaced, even white teeth, a strong jaw, long eyelashes, black curly hair, deep blue eyes, a large cranium, and a deep, resonant voice. These are amongst the 32 signs of a great man, and this is the basis of the prediction made at the Buddha's birth that he would become either a world ruler or a world teacher, that and possibly the use of astrology. King Suddhodana, anxious that his son should succeed him as the chief of the Shakyan or Sakyan clan, a small republic located between Kosala and Vaji, pampered him and plied him with every sort of pleasure. Gautama was so attracted to women that he actually lived in the women's quarters in his teens and 20s, and was doubtless acquainted with sex. I should say he lived in the women's quarters during the rainy season, specifically. He married the princess Yasodhara at the age of 16, and had a son, Rahula, by her, purportedly at the age of 29. According to one story, Gautama renounced the world in reaction to the aftermath of a party in which the musicians, all female, were lying sleeping about the palace in ungainly poses, snoring and exposing their breasts. It doesn't take much imagination to realize that Gautama was a rich playboy and probably sexually promiscuous as well, which may explain in part the severity of the renunciation that followed. In psychoanalytic terms, we might regard it as a compensation. For example, in the Sutta to Magandiya, the Magandiya Sutta, the Buddha says, quote, "Magandiya, formerly when I lived the home life I enjoyed myself, provided and endowed with the 5 chords of sensual pleasure, with forms cognizable by the eye, sounds cognizable by the ear, odors cognizable by the nose, flavors cognizable by the tongue, tangible cognizable by the body, that are wished for, desired, agreeable, and likable, connected with sensual desire, and provocative of lust. I had 3 palaces, one for the rainy season, one for the winter, and one for the summer. I lived in the rains palace for the 4 months of the rainy season, enjoying myself with musicians who were all female, and I did not go down to the lower palace." Unquote. Thus, as a suitable basis for his final renunciation and enlightenment, it was necessary for the Buddha to fulfill the life of the world completely. Remember that at this stage of his spiritual career, Gautama was a bodhisattva in his last birth, mere years away from final enlightenment. This self-description does not sound like the ruminations of a misogynist or a neurotic either. Okay, now, I would like to discuss specifically the negative views of women in the Pali Canon. I should add that I have found a few additional quotations, besides the ones which I'm going to refer to in this vein. So in addition to what I'm citing in this section, there are also additional passages in the Pali Canon as well, which further support my statements. The Pali Suttas include many negative views of women, including the statement that a woman is incapable of attaining Buddhahood, that the female birth is karmically inferior because a woman is subject to 5 types of suffering to which a man is not subject, namely being separated from her family, menstruation, pregnancy, childbirth, and being subservient to a man. That a wife is inferior to her husband and should be willing to obey him and even die rather than displease him in the slightest particular. And that a Buddhist nun, a bhikkhuni, no matter what her attainment or seniority, should be inferior to a monk or a bhikkhu of even a single day's seniority. The Buddha describes sexual intercourse as, quote, Dhamma's opposite, the low, vulgar ideal that is impure and ends in ablution, that is done in secrecy by couples, unquote, and states that it is better to insert one's penis into the mouth of a, quote, hideous, venomous viper or cobra, or a bed of red-hot coals, than that it should enter a woman, unquote, and that's from the Sutta Vibhanga. With reference to woman's capacity to elicit lust, the Buddha says that the female form is more seductive than any other object of sense, and refers to women as, quote, sharks and snares of Mara. The female form is so irresistible, in fact, that the Buddha says mothers and sons will commit incest, and a man might even commit necrophilia, given the chance, for which reason a monk may not approach a woman even if she is dead. That's from the Anguttara Nikaya. The Vinaya also includes cases of Buddhist monks engaging in these and other perverse erotic behaviors. The Buddha says that women are reborn with three qualities: miserliness, envy, and sensuality and lust, because of which most women are reborn in worlds of hellish suffering. That's from the Anguttara Nikaya. Elsewhere he says that women are angry, envious, miserly, and unintelligent, and therefore incapable of participating in government, engaging in business, or travel away from home. That's in the Anguttara Nikaya. He says that the ways of women are secretive, like Brahmins and heretics, those of perverse views. Like black snakes, women are impure, foul-smelling, frightening, dangerous, and disloyal. That's from the Anguttara Nikaya. They are insatiable in respect to sexual intercourse and childbirth, even on their deathbed. Also from the Anguttara Nikaya. The Buddha made it clear to Ananda that a monk should neither associate nor communicate with women if he can possibly avoid it, and that a monk who has sex with a woman will be subject to rebirth in a hellish world of suffering. The Pali Canon portrays women as cunning liars, secretive, fond of intrigue, and unfaithful. According to the Pali Canon, the original Sangha of the Buddha was a Sangha of men only. After the death of his father, King Suddhodana, about 7 or 8 years following the Buddha's enlightenment and the establishment of the Sangha, perhaps about 440 before the Common Era, the Buddha's aunt and foster mother, Mahapajapati Gautami, resolves to be ordained along with 500 women of the court. She approaches the Buddha when he is visiting Kapilavastu for permission to join the Sangha, but he refuses her request. Distraught, the women shave their heads and put on robes anyhow, and follow the Buddha to Vasali, a distance of about 300 kilometers or 186 miles. This must have taken them about 2 months, perhaps longer. Distraught and physically exhausted, she approaches Ananda, who is portrayed in the suttas as quite sympathetic to women in general, to intercede with the Buddha. Ananda approaches the Buddha on her behalf. Once again, the Buddha refuses. Ananda's subsequent discussion with the Buddha is quite famous. He asks the Buddha whether, therefore, women are capable of attainment. The Buddha admits that they are capable of attaining arhatship, the same as men. The self-contradiction in the Buddha's position thus exposed by Ananda, the Buddha finally relents, acceding to Ananda's request. But he declares that because of the ordination of women, the longevity of the Sangha will be halved, from 1,000 to only 500 years. Moreover, he imposes 8 special rules on the Bhikkhuni Sangha that permanently subordinates them to this Bhikkhuni Sangha. And these are called the 8 Garudhammas, and they are: 1. A nun who has been ordained, even for 100 years, must greet respectfully, rise up from her seat, salute with joined palms, and do proper homage to a monk ordained but that day. 2. A nun must not spend the rains in a residence where there are no monks. 3. Every half-month a nun should desire 2 things from the order of monks: the asking as to the date of the observance, the so-called Uposatha day, and the coming for the exhortation, the Bhikkhu Novada. Bhikkhu Novada. 4. After the 3-month rainy season retreat, a nun must invite before both orders in respect of 3 matters, namely what was seen, what was heard, and what was suspected. 5. A nun, offending against an important rule, must undergo manata, discipline or penance, for half a month before both orders, thereby doubling the penance that she's required to perform. And 6. When, as a probationer, she has trained in the 6 rules, the Chatdhamma, for 2 years, she should seek higher ordination from both orders. So once again, a bhikkhuni must be ordained by the Bhikkhuni Sangha and by the Bhikkhu Sangha. 7. A monk must not be abused or reviled in any way by a nun. And finally, 8. Admonition of monks by nuns is forbidden. Over the course of time, these 8 additional rules expanded to 311 rules for nuns, compared to 227 for monks. According to another computation, there are 110 extra rules for nuns. After 1,000 years, the Bhikkhuni Sangha died out in India and most other places. In Thailand, which follows the conservative Theravada tradition inherited from Sri Lanka, it is actually illegal for a woman to impersonate a monastic by putting on robes. Banning Ajahn Brahm's speech on Bhikkhuni ordination from the 11th United Nations Day of Vesak 2014 is merely the most recent confirmation of the misogyny of Theravada Buddhists. So, take a look at the online article banning Ajahn Brahm's speech on nuns was a spectacular own goal, and the link to that is on my blog. Note that restoring Bhikkhuni ordination does not restore gender equity between men and women, since the Buddhist formula of ordination for Bhikkhunis is inherently discriminatory. That was a footnote, and just give me one moment to find my place. There are many rules in the Buddhist Vinaya, the monastic rules applicable to monks concerning women and nuns. A monk may not have sexual intercourse or lustful bodily contact with a woman, nor may he make lustful remarks to a woman, including asking her for sexual favors. He may not arrange for a date, affair, or marriage with a woman on behalf of another person. An unrelated nun may not wash a monk's robes or give him robes as a gift. A nun may not wash, dye, or card raw wool for a monk. A monk may not lie down in the same building as a woman. He may not teach a woman more than 5 or 6 lines of Dhamma or Dharma unless another knowledgeable man is present. He may not exhort the nuns in the nuns' quarters unless she is ill. He may not exhort the nuns for worldly gain in any case. He may not give an unrelated nun cloth for a robe, or sew it, or have it sewn, unless it is given in exchange. A monk may not travel on the road with a nun, even between villages, unless it is by caravan and the road is unsafe, or travel with a nun by boat in any direction, upstream or downstream, other than directly crossing a river. He may not travel on a road with a woman in any case. He may not eat alms food obtained by the prompting of a nun. He may not sit alone with a nun. He may not accept food from an unrelated nun. The punishment for violating any of these rules ranges from expulsion from the order to verbal acknowledgement, depending on the severity of the offense. Okay, that completes the section on negative views of women in the Pali Canon. I'm sure you have a very vivid idea now of what the Pali Canon says about women on the negative side. However, that is not the whole story. There are also positive views of women in the Pali Canon, and I would like to discuss those next. Despite the views summarized above, the Buddha also expresses many positive views concerning women in various places. I've already mentioned the Buddha's acknowledgement that women are capable of attaining arhatship. This is elaborated at great length in other suttas, where the Buddha goes to some length to describe all of the levels of attainment, from faith follower to arhat, and emphasizes that many members of the Sangha, including both men and women, have attained all of the various stages of spiritual development. The Buddha criticizes the Brahmin practice of arranged marriage and defends the right of women to marry freely for love. When the married Bhaga householders Nakula Pitta and Nakula Mata approach the Buddha and declare their love for each other, asking him whether they can ensure that they would be reborn together, rather than criticize them, the Buddha praises the couple and declares that they can be reborn together as deva beings, a destination reserved for the most pious, if they observe the same faith, morality, generosity, and wisdom. The evidence of the Pali Canon, especially the songs of the wise women, or Therigatha, clearly shows that the early Sangha included many women, both monastic and lay, many of whom were highly esteemed and spiritually advanced practitioners, just as was the case during the early Vedic period. Perhaps most telling of all is the Buddha's attitude to the women who approached him in numerous suttas to speak with him and ask him questions. There is no difference whatever in these suttas in how the Buddha was approached or spoken to, or how the Buddha spoke to them, including the topics and level of discourse. There is, in short, no difference at all in the suttas, considered as a whole, regardless of whether the questioner is male or female. And it's clear also that these were not all female. Usually when the people went to visit the Buddha, there were other monastics present. He traveled with an entourage. And although certainly one does get the impression that males were the predominant group in his entourage, there's no suggestion whatsoever that when a woman approached the Buddha and spoke to him, that there were not male monastics present. So it was a mixed gender group. And this is perhaps the best evidence of all for the view that the Buddha made no distinction between women and men. In the introduction to his translation of the numerical discourses of the Buddha, the Anguttara Nikaya, Bhikkhu Bodhi acknowledges that the positive and negative statements concerning women found throughout the Pali Canon are mutually self-contradictory. It is impossible to believe that the Buddha held all of these views simultaneously. Bodhi also doubts the historicity of the famous dialogue in which Ananda convinces the Buddha to admit women to the Sangha, citing, quote, anachronisms hard to reconcile with other chronological information in the canon and commentaries, unquote. Scholars also doubt the antiquity of the Garodhammas, one of which refers to probationary nuns, a category that did not exist when Mahapajapati was ordained. Consequently, it cannot be original. There is also reason to disbelieve the account of the admission of Mahapajapati to the Sangha, since the exposition of offerings in the so-called Dakina Vibhanga Sutta, in the middle-length discourses of the Buddha, that is the Majjhima Nikaya, presents the Bhikkhuni Sangha as already existing when Mahapajapati goes for refuge to the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha, without any suggestion that the Buddha opposed her admission. It appears then that this whole complex of ideas was invented to justify the Garodhammas. In defense of the Buddha's purported reluctance to ordain women, apologists have cited possible concerns about social prejudice, including the Buddha's realization that the Sangha could not survive without popular support, and the safety of the nuns, who would be subjected not only to social scorn and even abuse, but also by the ravages of the environment at a time when the Sangha had not yet established itself with parks and monasteries. By accepting women into the Sangha, the Buddha was setting himself against the entire late Vedic tradition of the Deva worshippers that was now universally accepted by the society of his time. It was unheard of for women to leave the household life and follow the path of a samana, much as it was in Hindu India until very recently. Although he was criticized for breaking up the family unit, and the Sangha was not welcomed everywhere, it is a testament to the Buddha's charisma and the respect in which he was held that there is not more indication of dissension in the Pali Canon than there is. Thus, the Pali Canon itself forces us to make a decision. Either we accept that the Buddha reluctantly admitted women to the Sangha on what amounts to a technicality, but instituted rules to curtail and limit the damage resulting from this concession, or we take the view that the misogynistic passages are later additions that reflect the social prejudices of 5th century BCE India, especially male monastics that we have seen began to supplant the older, more tolerant view of women during the late Vedic period. The latter view is consistent with the Buddha's declaration that he considered the Brahmanism of his time to be a degenerate remnant of a primordial tradition that he sought to restore. And if we identify that primordial tradition, perhaps with Indus Valley civilization, then we can see how his treatment of women makes sense, because that was the treatment of women in the original Indian civilization. With respect to the latter, it is interesting to note that the Buddha clearly opposed the caste system, arranged marriage, and authoritarianism, all things that appeared during the late Vedic period with the rise of the newer Deva worshippers who cast down the Asuras to the foot of Mount Meru. This makes one wonder if the older tradition to which the Buddha alludes was in fact that of the older system of Asura worship, which also, like the Buddha, opposed the Vedas and the gods, or Devas, that is, Aryanism, despite the reversal of terms that clearly predominates in the Pali Canon itself. Okay, I'd like to continue to discuss the view of women in the early Buddhist councils, starting with the first Buddhist council. The first Buddhist council was convened in the year following the Buddha's passing on, his parinirvana, about 400 before the Common Era, according to modern scholarship, by King Ajatasattu, or Ajatasattu, king of Magadha in Rajgir, the capital, according to tradition. Although in his final instructions the Buddha had said that the Sangha should have no leader after him, but should be led by the Dharma alone, Mahakassapa, the Buddha's foremost disciple in ascetic practices, assumed the leadership of the Sangha after the Buddha's death and called the first Buddhist council together in response to suggestions by the monk Subhada that with the Buddha's death, the Vinaya rules of the order might be relaxed. Although this is presented in the Theravada literature as a criticism, in fact, according to the Great Passing, the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, the Buddha had indicated that after his death, the lesser and minor rules of the Vinaya might be abolished. Thus, Mahakassapa convened, according to the account, 500 arhants, an unlikely number, especially considering where they met, because there's a particular cave where they were supposed to have met, which could not possibly have held so many people. In any case, the Mahakassapa convened a number of arhants to consolidate the tradition of the Dhamma, or Dharma, including Ananda, who conveniently attained arhantship during the night before the council began to meet, from July to the following January. Upali, the foremost disciple in keeping the precepts, began by reciting the rules of the Vinaya in their entirety, especially the Parajika, the rules that entail mandatory and automatic expulsion from the Sangha, that is, sex, stealing, killing, and lying about one's spiritual accomplishments. And then Ananda recited the suttas. Ananda had a hard time of it, however. He was severely criticized, presumably by Mahakassapa, for convincing the Buddha to ordain women. Many male arhants were extremely opposed to this, despite the clear fact that the Buddha had approved it. There was also the question of the minor and lesser rules of the Vinaya that the Buddha had said in his final instructions to Ananda might be abolished. Since it had not occurred to Ananda to ask the Buddha which rules he was referring to, the conservative council decided to keep them all. The council also decided to allow the ordination of women, subject to the 8 Garodhammas, and expanded the rules to include an additional 110 or so more rules for nuns, despite the fact that the Buddha had also declared that no new rules were to be made. It seems likely that the 8 Garodhammas were codified at this time, perhaps as a compromise between two competing factions. The foregoing account creates serious theological issues for the Hinayana in general and for the Theravada in particular, since all of the members of the first Buddhist council are regarded as arhants. This problem came to a head 100 years later during the second Buddhist council, during which the fallibility and imperfection of arhants became a bone of contention between two nascent Buddhist schools, the Mahasangikas, who took the view that arhants are fallible, and the Staviras, who took the view that arhants are infallible. These differences were summarized in the 5 points of Mahadeva. The Mahasangikas represented the majority view and subsequently developed into the Mahayana, whereas the minority, the Staviras, subsequently developed into the Theravada. With respect to the present topic, it is clear that the first Buddhist council endorsed a view of women and nuns that is fundamentally misogynistic, and the Pali Canon, which is the record of Buddhist teachings accepted by the Theravada, is explicitly so. As I have also shown, the first Buddhist council overruled the Buddha's own injunctions to not appoint a leader, to abolish the lesser and minor rules, and subsequently councils clearly also added rules, and in particular, rules designed to subordinate the nuns to the monks. That the attainments of arhantship and Buddhahood are different also seems to be supported by the canonical assertion, if we accept it, that women can become arhants but not Buddhas. The 10 powers of an arhat also differ significantly from the 10 powers of a Buddha according to the Pali texts. On the other hand, if we accept the Hinayana Theravada view that arhants are infallible, then we must accept Buddhist misogyny as a view. If we are not willing to accept the inferiority of women, we cannot in good conscience accept the lineage derived from the minority Sthavira position. Therefore, we cannot accept Hinayana or Theravada as the final summation of Dharma. Since the Buddha indicated that in the absence of consensus we must accept majority rule, we are compelled to the alternative view as the correct dharmic view. That is the view that women are not inferior beings. Next, I'd like to discuss the view of women in Buddhism today. After the Buddha's death, about 400 before the Common Era, Indian society continued to suppress women. Beginning in the 5th century of the Common Era, and by the 11th century, the practice of sati, or widow burning, became the model of how a pious wife should respond to the death of her husband. The Muslim incursion into India in the 12th through 16th centuries, which virtually wiped Buddhism out of India, including the Bhikkhuni Sangha, followed by the British conquest of India, beginning in the 17th century, further intensified the already deeply rooted Indian misogyny. Meanwhile, the Bhikkhuni Sangha had virtually disappeared from India and Sri Lanka by the 11th century. Widely disparaged in Buddhist countries and discriminated against where it did exist, the Bhikkhuni Sangha only survived continuously in Eastern or Chinese Buddhism, ironically in view of the Confucian ideas of the subordination of women, which caused them to locate their monasteries in remote places. Today, efforts are underway in several countries to restore the Bhikkhuni Sangha, although based on the old model. The Dalai Lama has made similar efforts in northeast India. As a result, there are now about 130,000 Buddhist nuns in the world today. Socially, Buddhist women have fared better than Indian women, however. In general, Buddhist societies respect single women, including spinsters, divorced women, and widows, and I did mention earlier also the ancient Buddhist acceptance of prostitution. Laws concerning divorce and the division of property and children are fairly equal between husband and wife. Outside China, where Confucian notions of the inferiority of women predominate, women are fairly free, including in business, trade, and agriculture. Even in Eastern Buddhism, however, Zen or Chan Buddhism emphasizes sexual equality. Women may also be found exercising the professions of law and medicine, and have been politically influential. Many Buddhist women enjoy sexual freedom, property rights, and self-determination. Women may also be influential in religious institutions. The Mahayana tends to view men and women as equal, whereas Theravada still sees the Bodhisattva path as suited only for rare and heroic men. Female spiritual figures are most widespread in Vajrayana or Tantra. So in conclusion, Indian culture differs. I think I'm a little ahead of myself here. Actually, maybe my conclusion is long. Anyway, let's carry on. In conclusion, Indian culture differs from the other great originating cultures of humanity in that most cultures began with the patriarchal suppression of women, followed by their progressive emancipation, whereas Indian civilization began with women holding a position of unique power and privilege, followed by their progressive suppression, commencing around 1100 before the Common Era, and continuing on, unfortunately, to the present time. This transvaluation of all values appears to have coincided with a social schism, in which an original cult of Asura worship, great cosmological abstractions associated with the powers of nature, was displaced by a new aggressive cult of Deva worship based on notions of patriarchal authority, the status quo, Brahmanic dominance, caste, and misogyny derived from the Aryan incursion. By the time of the Buddha, Vedic society was breaking down, and a counterculture of wandering shamans, suggestive of the later Shakti and Shaiva cults that eventually developed into Tantra, had emerged. After studying meditative or cognitive, that is to say jhana yoga, with Brahmin and Jain teachers in succession, the Buddha joined the Samanas and became an extreme ascetic for a number of years, almost dying in the process, followed by his enlightenment experience. It is noteworthy that both the Shakti and Shaivite cults were not misogynistic in their attitudes to the female principle. The conflicting attitudes toward men and women in Indian society appear in the Pali Canon in the conflicting attitudes to women attributed to the Buddha. However, it appears that the Buddha himself did not make a fundamental distinction between men and women, asserting that both men and women are equally capable of attainment, and freely teaching women and admitting them to the Sangha on an equal basis, rather like Yeshua, the founder of Christianity, for which the latter was also severely criticized by the Jewish establishment in Jerusalem. If the Buddha did make a distinction between the orders of monks and nuns, it was to protect the nuns and appease social prejudice. This unpopularly tolerant attitude must have created a great deal of consternation amongst the more conservative male followers of the Buddha, but they appear to have largely avoided criticism out of respect for the Buddha. This changed after the Buddha's death, when a major rift seems to have occurred during the First Buddhist Council, when the male monastics attacked Ananda for supporting the ordination of women. That they were not the only side of this debate is suggested by the fact that a compromise appears to have been reached in which the order of nuns was subordinated to the order of monks, but allowed to exist. Otherwise, it seems likely that the nuns would simply have been suppressed altogether. The pious forgeries concerning Mahapajapati, Ananda's subsequent debate with the Buddha, and the Gaudama were created to explain the final decision of the First Buddhist Council, which led ultimately to the disappearance of the Bhikkhuni Sangha. Moreover, the addition of numerous special rules for nuns, all with the purpose of subordinating the nuns to the monks, clearly violates the Buddha's instructions not to add extra rules to the Vinaya. Over the following 3 centuries, numerous misogynistic passages were introduced into the suttas, while the more favorable statements of the Buddha concerning women were also allowed to stand because they were too well established and too well known to be refuted, thus creating the somewhat bizarre self-contradictions that we find in the Pali texts today. And as I mentioned, in addition to the ones which I cited, I'm still reading the Pali Canon, and I found additional ones, pretty much in the same vein, though. Nothing that really changes our view. Very likely, over the course of 300 years, there were diverse currents and subcurrents of thought amongst the anonymous redactors of the Pali Canon itself, of which we know very little or nothing. Meanwhile, Indian society continued in its misogynistic course, exacerbated by Muslim and British colonial influences. Thus, in contemporary Nepal, for example, which was a little more removed from those influences, we find a significantly more liberal society than India proper, since Nepal was never subjugated to Muslim and British influences. I say a little because Nepalese culture is still fundamentally, like Indian culture, misogynistic, I believe, but it is a more liberal, more tolerant society. Buddhism itself split into 2 large movements, one aligned with the dominant conservative social attitude, and one aligned with the more liberal attitude that, it appears, was actually advocated by the Buddha. Fortunately, for those of us who do not believe in the inferiority of women, The latter has become the majority view in the Buddhist world today, and that, of course, is the Mahayana. Okay, this actually didn't take 2 hours, contrary to my prediction. That does conclude my talk for today. Thank you very much for your attention. Before we conclude with the dedication of merit, does anyone have any questions or discussion of this topic? You're very welcome, Kryolos. Any questions or discussion? We are going to conclude with, we are going to dedicate the merit today to the victims of sexual abuse. So if no one has any questions. Thank you, Bina. It seems no one has any questions or discussion, so let's conclude with the dedication of merit, and please today let's dedicate the merit to the victims of sexual abuse worldwide. I will put the traditional dedication in the chat, but we'll revise it slightly. Whatever understanding, whatever positive forces come from this, may it go deeper and deeper and act as a cause to reach enlightenment for the benefit of all. We will now observe 2 minutes of silence, during which we will dedicate the merit of this talk to the victims of sexual abuse worldwide. So please join me for 2 minutes of silence. Okay, thank you very much for this opportunity to discuss Dharma. It is my pleasure and privilege. Until next Tuesday at 4 p.m., Second Lifetime, Namaskar.